Hey, what's going on, everyone? Unedited PPMD here to talk to you guys about something I was just thinking about recently. It's a question I get occasionally in my Twitch chat. People will say, we've had the golden age in the past and in the documentary, and then we had the brawl era and then the platinum age. But that was a little while ago. What are we in now? And I never really had a good answer for them. But I thought about it, and I think I do finally have one. Thinking about all the changes that have been coming to Melee recently, especially over the last 2 years or almost 2 years, and I think I'd like to call it the technology age. You guys can workshop the name in the comments if you want. Be glad to hear it. But a little before I get to that, for some of you that might be newer players that don't actually know the eras I'm talking about, I'd like to define those first, put the technology age, the modern day in context, and then we kind of go from there. What it's like, are there problems with it? Are there things that can come out of it? And so on. And so basically, I'm just going to start there. I'm going to start with the Golden Age. Really, the first major era of Melee. Of course, there was the very beginning, and then there was the build up to the Golden Age. But the Golden Age is the first major era of Melee, so I'm going to kind of start there. And I'm not informed to talk about the earlier one anyway. But the Golden Age is basically when Melee gets into MLG for the first time in around 2005, and it carries the momentum really strong into 2006, and then it's dropped from MLG, but the momentum still goes okay through 2007. There's so many storylines. There's a lot more money in the game than there, had been before that. And there were so many regions that were strong. I mean, Japan was really strong, Europe was really strong, Australia was strong, from my understanding. I know there were even some Alaskan players. I think they're starting to rise up again, but there were some Alaskan players that people knew about. So just so many places were kind of strong at that time. And I think that's something that kind of marked that age as such a special time for a lot of people. Moving on from that, though, we have the Brawl era. We have the overcorrection from that. We kind of have the crash. There's a kind of character reshuffling. Marth and Fox didn't do as well in the Brawl era as beforehand. Regions often really weakened. The player base diminished. Storylines often built a lot more slowly. And there just wasn't much money in the game. And of course, that was just due to Brawl coming out. I mean, we can certainly point to other factors, but Brawl coming out just was such a big change for the scene. And other things came up with it, of course. We got Wombo Combo out of that, but by and large, Melee did go through more of a struggle period there. And I've talked a little bit about the impacts on the meta in my Falco's Place in the metagame video, which maybe I'll follow up eventually. But if you're more curious about the character impacts, recommend you go check that out. That being said, we got the Platinum Age. We're going to speed right through this into something more modern. So the Brawl era was from 2008 when Brawl came out till, right on through 2013, Apex 2013, and then when Evo picked up Melee, and then Melee takes a sharp change, a sharp upward trend into the Platinum Age. And this is something that, many more people might be familiar with in the scene now. Esports orgs come in. We get money again. We have MLG another time. Probably more money than we ever had. We start doing some streaming and getting onto Twitter and Facebook, and then Smashboards dies, not dies, but everyone kind of migrates from there to Facebook and Twitter. And Facebook was actually, I think, more used than Twitter in this time, or when I'm going to define this time, being from 2013 to about 2016. And then that momentum kind of goes, and we don't really get like too much more of a rise, but everything stays pretty good in the scene in that way until about 2016, maybe later. And I'm going to talk about why there could be some confusion there. And now I kind of like to term the period after this, because I don't know if I want to extend the Platinum Age several years. I'll leave that up to you guys. But for fun, I call the period after 2016 till right before quarantine the Clutchbox era. And I mean, it kind of works out pretty well because 2016, I think the scene starts to change, not just because of, me not competing at the time, but also there's a lot of other things. HBox just switches and starts to dominate. He dominates the narrative at this point. IRL coaching becomes much more prevalent. And I make that distinction because online coaching becomes much more prevalent a little bit later, as you guys could imagine. there's the planking thing where HBox is grabbing the ledge a good bit, and people want, or sometimes M2K is, and people want to talk about ledge grab limit, but because we no longer are on Smashboards, we don't really have a good way to sort out the rules, and that never gets finalized. We never end up making a real definitive ruling on it. And so this is something that highlights kind of the fragmented nature of the community that is the way it is now, and that's something worth keeping in mind. We move over to Twitter over Facebook, which is, I think, a big change that isn't talked about a lot. At least in Facebook groups, there were a lot of people that were kind of communally in there. But with Twitter, you can be your own island, right? You can choose who you want to follow. You can choose who you want to interact with, especially now that Twitter's added more features. And so we're seeing, and then, as we see more content getting picked up, like that, we're just gonna see more of the people being their own island, and I think Clutchbox era really kind of just continues the trend of the Platinum Age in terms of like storylines. There were some new ones and everything like that, but it just kind of felt like a continuation. So I almost continued the Platinum Age just through 2013 all the way through quarantine. You guys can choose to do that with what you want, but there's Facebook and then Twitter, so it's still kind of an awkward change. But anyway, we go through Genesis. What is it? Genesis 4, I believe it was, in 2020, and Zane beats HBox, and I think that's right. And so when I say the Clutchbox era, that's a good time to talk about how things are going to change, right? And so that's where I start talking about there's going to be a new era, right? And I think people were kind of wanting to do this, but they didn't really have a good way to talk about it at the time. And then we kind of talked about the quarantine era, but I don't think that really felt right. And then we have this weird time now where we're kind of doing online, kind of doing offline. Sometimes we're quarantining more than others. And I kind of want to move past that and just look at what's happening in Melee. And so that's why I'm going to call it the technology, or possibly the computer age, what we're in right now. And that's going to be from the release of Slippy in the summer of 2020 until present day. So that's going to be, first half of 2022. Kind of expect that to continue for a while, but you guys can let me know what you think about that. But yeah, we switch more from offline to online Melee. Uncle Punch, other training tools are here now. People can practice better and more targeted things like Slide Off. Streaming becomes so much more common and almost required for a higher level player. And if you want longevity, more people are moving to YouTube now. So we're seeing people branch out into more content platforms, becoming more of a brand, looking more for the longevity for their lifespan. They don't want to just be focused on being a player. And because there's not as much money in being a player right now, but especially if you're streaming from home, you're streaming all these tournament runs, you are going to be able to have much more longevity. So you are seeing players make use of that as well. But you're also seeing a lot of controller alternatives coming out. And it's coming out somewhat regularly. I mean, even just in the past week or so, there's something called a fob GameCube controller that I'm not fully understanding, but there is an alternative using magnets and so on that are coming out. And, of course, we have the boxes. We have ergonomic options for people. And so we're having different ways to experience the game, but we're also having so many online tourneys, because online tourneys, while still difficult to organize, you don't have to worry about setups and, corralling everyone, where they roughly are. And there could be so many online tourneys, especially recently, it could be hard to watch all of them. Some people even enter multiple online tournaments in a day or several in a weekend, which, of course, is basically impossible for offline tournaments unless you're just having some in the same area, or you finish one day and fly to another one somehow the next day or 2 days after that. And I was kind of thinking about how storylines were working in this, because I was talking about storylines in the other eras, and what I realized was happening is storylines fall and rise very rapidly. They change much more. Like maybe a player's washed, like if IBDW loses to Slug the Ices at an East Coast Friday or something. Maybe everyone says he's washed, but then he goes on a great run and he does something really impressive later, or he just beats Slug back at a tourney like a few days later. Then it's like that's a big narrative for people. Or the best example I have for you is Bobby Big Balls, who in IBDW's GigaSwap tournament, he gets 9th at the East Coast one and he wins the West Coast one, 1 day apart. And there were still very difficult players for him in both brackets. And, he kind of talks about that's just the way it is when you enter so much. And so I think and he's not the only example of this. There are just other players that just have this, other rising players. And so I think it's very interesting to kind of note that if you're kind of a spectator, if you're a fan, you want to kind of just keep up with these trends. And maybe this is very interesting for you to keep up with it. Maybe you like the variance, right? But I also would say in this era, because of so much practice, because of maybe focused practice, coaching work, things like that, so many characters have brought out their innovations in a much greater way in this era. So, I mean, we've seen, a lot of new Falcos bringing stuff out. Peach has revolutionized as a character. Falcon has continued to revolutionize as a character. We see a lot of Sheiks now, especially at Smash World Tour last year. So, I mean, and of course, we're always seeing Fox players change and improve and bring more things in. So this is something that, and of course, those are not the only characters, right? I just mentioned Ice Climbers earlier. And so I think this is something that we're going to continue kind of seeing as people are able to grind more out. And that's going to only continue as, things like Uncle Punch improve as tools that give people more. And speaking of giving tools to give people more, there's more modding tools out. So you're going to see more stages, you're going to see more characters, you're going to see more cosmetics. And you're also probably going to see other possible fixes to Melee, whether these are software or people just try to push for different rule sets eventually if they can't have the software fixes or whatever, right? And so this is something that's also being discussed more and more as we understand more about how Melee works, again, using the technology we have to go in there. As I've alluded to a few times before as well, coaching, very common in this age. And we're showing another pipeline for players to support themselves, but also we're seeing that there are players, enough of them that want to improve, that are willing to take this. They're willing to pay what the coaches are asking for, and they're willing to grow from that. And so this is something that's happened very recently as well. And sure, it might be possibly partly due to the fact that you can't go out and visit these players, at a major even so easily now. But some of that is just going to be due to the fact that there are going to be more people grinding. So I think maybe even having more tools out there has let more people who want to work at this, maybe more like a tier 1 esport, League of Legends, Dota, and so on, to exist better in the Melee space. But yeah, so I call it, again, just in case anyone's curious, the technology age. The reason I call it that is just because I feel like it's so much stuff connected to the game, sort of physically or through coding, or things like that. So again, we are talking about controllers. We're talking about how the game is largely online now through the technology that's been built or coded, changes, mods, things like that. So, sometimes it is going to be through physical things, but sometimes it's just going to be through the physical work that we do on our PCs, right? And I think like that physical, that material and immaterial, or however you want to think about it, maybe is also an interesting point of the technology age. But yeah, just a great point to highlight this is that Fizzy changed how online matchmaking works. We currently have an unranked that acts kind of like ranked, and now everyone's experience is totally different, right? This would have been unheard of 3 years ago before we even had any Slippy out at all. And now Fizzy has so much control over the typical Melee experience for all the Melee players. And that's a really important thing to kind of keep in mind here. That we maybe in a way we also are having a bit of centralization of authority in some ways. But that's its own topic. And of course, Fizzy isn't abusing that, which, I'm sure we're all very grateful for. And, one final note about being online is we're going to be encouraging more content work, like what I'm doing now. I wouldn't have imagined, doing so many talks at one point. Of course, I love doing these talks, but now there's more thoughts about, well, let's do more elaborate guides or things like that. And I have more of an idea how to make that happen and with editors and things like that. And so I think these are just things that are starting to happen more, and will only continue as these trends push us forward. And you guys continue to enjoy it, I suppose. But like I said, are there concerns? Are there concerns? There are good things. We've talked about a lot of good things in the age. And I'll talk after this about ways this can progress into something better. But are there concerns that we have in this age through the innovations we've had, or just otherwise? And I think there are a few, so I'd like to go over them. In no particular order, the first one I've got is probably maybe the biggest one: the legal issues we would have with Nintendo. The more we mod the game, the more we invest into Slippy, the more we try to do software fixes, things like that, the more we maybe wind up with another situation with Nintendo where they cancel Big House. Would they go after Fizzy? Things like that. And then if we freeze stages, of course, these are also things that Nintendo wouldn't want us to be doing, expanding UCF or whatever. And so this is something that we have to kind of think about as we move forward. How do we handle Nintendo? Because the more we innovate, the more, we differ from vanilla, the more Nintendo will legally feel they need to be involved. And this is just something that we have to grapple with as a community. The second point is the controller arms race. And that's kind of like, and there are a lot of ways to approach this situation. I'm not going to give you a controller arms race overview, and you could just say the controller situation if arms race sounds too upsetting. But the idea is basically, do we want to continue to improve all controllers and just continue to improve a bunch of them just because some controllers have advantages? Do we want to try and balance them around a certain ideal, not necessarily the GameCube controller, but what do we think is healthiest for competition? A lot of different ways to approach this. But again, it's mostly screaming on Twitter or a few private discussions. And so it can be hard for people to know what's actually going on, or if anything is really even going on, because it is a hard discussion. That's why nothing has been solved yet. But yeah, this highlights the further fragmentation of the scene, and it's something that we need to kind of keep in mind and hopefully work towards a solution on. And then this is not the biggest deal, my third point, but it is something I've kind of been thinking about since learning about the concept of innovators and honers. Innovators being people that come up with new ideas and try them out. Honers being those who take the ideas and just refine them and grind them out as much as possible. So in my view, innovation might be a little bit harder to reward now in the community because people get exposed to a new idea through just grinding on unranked or playing online tourneys that might not even count for rankings. And these things can just get copied much more quickly as well. And, that might lead to people just saying, well, I'm just going to follow the meta. I'm just going to, do the stuff that's like, already done, and it's going to be a little bit more straightforward. And then people might play more of the same, which maybe is fine, but maybe it's less interesting for spectators. So it's just something to think about. I don't think we're there. I don't think everyone plays the same or anything like that, but it is a possibility based on how these concepts could work out, and maybe it's happening a little bit, maybe not. You can share your opinion on that. And then my fourth point, something else to be a little concerned about is it might be a little harder to feel a sense of community because, we're playing alone more. You're not forced to play online to get the strongest experience of the game. And, we could have a harder time, just bonding as a community because of that. And so, this is not necessarily an all bad point, though, because, I recently learned that people that don't feel safe at tournaments or that are too young to go to tournaments, their parents wouldn't want them to go, things like that, they can play online, and that can be better for them. So this is not necessarily an all negative point, but it is something worth considering if nothing else. And a lot of these things, especially like the Nintendo and controller ones, could lead to a new age of Melee eventually. This could, there could be a before Nintendo takes serious action point and an after point, just as a consideration. And then, we have a great shift as a community. And maybe it's a good shift, right? Like maybe things go well for us and we're able to just do more with Melee. And so but there is something to think about with all of that. And as a last consideration, as a where we might go from here, what other forces could bring us into a different age from the technology age, or take these factors and add more things in. I'd like to bring up to everyone how Evo really changed Melee. And sure, Brawl coming out did. I don't think something like that would happen, but if there was a Melee HD, which I don't believe will happen, but, Ranked will probably change Melee and accelerate the technology age more. But really what I want to talk about are things a little more practical. Ludwig will probably do more. He does want to run a really big Melee tournament this year, and he might want to do some of that more and run big events, and that might be something that changes Melee a lot. Similarly, there are more esports organizations that want to do content. Of course, I'm very happy with Golden Guardians, but they're not the only ones doing that. Maybe something from that, some business player connection, is able to be greater than the sum of its parts and create something more for Melee too. And yeah, so I think there's a lot of places we can go from here. I think there's a lot going on in this age that's very different from the previous ages, but of course has so much, so much of an echo of the past going through it. You know, the move to social media, the way some of the storylines have gone, Clutchbox. You know, that still happens, right? So, you know, there's a lot to consider here about where we're going. But I hope you guys at least have a better understanding of a broad view of the history of the scene, a way to think about where we are now and where we're going to go forward. And that's really what I wanted to do with this video. Let me know if I did okay with that, if you guys like the age we're in now, if you want the future age to be dominated by Waluigi Dittos on Brinstar. Let me know all of it. Very curious. Thank you for your time and have a great day, everyone. See ya.